Okay, so this is our final speaker for the day. And this is Osama Metata. I told you.
Well done. Yeah, it's very good.
But Osama is from the University of Bristol. And just before he starts, to let you know that this session will now run until 15:15. And then if you could head up to the Oliver Thompson Theatre again, there'll be some networking nibbles and what's the final thing? Demos, more demos. And then the closing keynotes will start at 5 p.m. as scheduled. All right?
Great, yeah. Thank you very much for the invitation and for all you to come and listen to me talk. I always wanted to be the final speaker of the day, so my dream has come through. So yeah, so I work in co-design, working a lot with visually impaired people, but also in this space where we try to co-design with both visually impaired and sighted people and think about what we could do in that space. And I'll dive that right in. I don't have much time, I guess. I think it's quite interesting for me as a sighted person to use co-design as a method. And Stephen, thank you. You've already done a lot of groundwork describing what co-design and participatory design is. I know there is a difference, but I'll use them interchangeably in this talk. And in one sense, it's like I don't have access to that experience of being visually impaired or being blind, so therefore I need to engage with the right people so I can design the right thing. And that's usually one of the motivations for doing co-design, to qualify a little bit of the stuff that Stephen was already talking about. If you want to, you know, it's a kind of pragmatic motivation. If you want to design the right thing, it's best to involve the people who have the right kind of experiences you're designing for. But there is also sort of a more political, ethical, moral motivation, and this is it's the right thing to do to engage with people, especially people with disabilities, because they tend to be quite marginalized in society and having a say in what controls and influences their experiences. So co-design, I would say, help us achieve those both motivations. So there's kind of a bit of a spectrum between these two, and I myself tend to find myself oscillating between those two motivations. But this comes with a tension in my experience, which I wanted to share with you today. I thought that would be a good idea given the theme of the conference. And yeah, ramps, right? We've all seen these things, right? I mean, there's a house. It doesn't necessarily have access for a person with a wheelchair, so we put a ramp on. That's what we have here, and I think there's some remarkable things about ramps. First of all, they're not always that pretty. They always feel like they're kind of out of style. And they also feel like an afterthought, right? I mean, the house was built, and then we thought, maybe there's a new tenant moving in, or maybe there's some kind of legislation or something. We need to do something about that, so let's put a ramp in. I think that's interesting because it captures what I feel is a tension between designing for accessibility and designing for inclusion. And maybe you could even go further to think that there is some kind of clash between what we think of as the medical model of disability and the social model of disability. So I come across a lot of ramps in my work. So I wanted to share some reflections and lessons around this idea and this tension of thinking about accessibility and thinking about inclusion, basically. So that's what I will attempt to do. It's quite an ambitious thing, I think, in the time given, but let's see. So I want to talk about two domains, digital audio workstations and inclusive education. So the first one comes from a project that I did when I was back in Queen Mary. It was actually a collaboration between Queen Mary, Bath, and Goldsmiths. The DPEC project stands for Design Patterns for Inclusive Education. So we were interested in this space of working with visually impaired and blind musicians, audio production specialists, sound engineers, and seeing what we can do in that space. And it's an interesting space because something quite remarkable happened. I mean, working with audio seems to be a natural space for somebody who's blind or has a visual impairment. And there was this interesting shift from old style, tangible audio workstations to the digital audio workstation. And the digital workstation is now the standard in the industry, and it has a lot of visual stuff. I don't know if you're into audio editing and whatnot, but it's quite complex, and it's extremely visual ways of engaging with sound editing and engaging with audio, even from the creative side. So what we wanted to do is just work with a number of visually impaired and blind participants. We had 10 professionals from a number of domains. Some of them were audio, radio producers, others were musicians, others were sound engineers. And we had about 12 co-design workshops over, I think, about a year and a half. And we tried to understand what kind of challenges they come across insofar as they engage with sighted people as customers, as clients, as commissioners, and so on and so forth. Now, If you do co-design, participatory design, you know there's a lot of visual methods. Okay, and these visual methods make sense to the extent that they, A, everybody can see, and second, you're designing, and you have this kind of visual design thinking and also designing visual interfaces. So that's the first challenge, like how do we do that with somebody who cannot see or a group of people who cannot see, while we as designers can see? And the first instinct was, well, okay, let's make these design methods accessible. Maybe we could have tangible post-it notes and audio/tangible storyboarding stuff and all kind of stuff. So we had this kind of what we thought are accessible materials with, this is an electronic tag readers with adhesive tags that you place on foam. We can create all these nice tangible storyboards and whatnot. That did not work at all, actually. What often happens is that when we engage with these extremely professional, extremely busy people is that they just leave the material away and just talk about stuff, right? So we realized we built a ramp. That's what we were doing. And it's an interesting ramp because it created some asymmetries between us and the participants. There was issues to do with how do we express ideas. Are we designing for the expression of ideas, or are we designing for just the means for doing so? There's also questions about who controls what, who controls this kind of expression. So this were quite an interesting shock to me as I moved into this space. I had not worked with visually impaired people before that project in the sense of doing co-design and participatory design. So we thought, you know, scratch it all. Let's start from scratch. Let's not build a ramp. Let's think about the ramp before we build a house, as it were. So we started with a blank thing, and we thought, you know what, we're going to do a lot of live coding with the participants inside the workshops, and we come up with this idea of having malleable prototypes. So the idea is we have some very good programmer with us in the workshops. They were quite long workshops, 3-4 hours sometimes, a lot of dedication from the participants actually. And so a topic comes up like playback, and we would just create a quick playback widget, or maybe how to control tracks or waveform. But we make that malleable in the sense that we come up with different alternatives for every little tiny design feature. For example, you want to, we use some things like some haptic devices, and you want to scroll through the track. Okay, so we can scroll from the right to the left, or maybe you can scroll from the left to the right. Or maybe you can go on the z-axis. So we create an alternative for each little design ideas that comes, and gradually we build a portfolio of alternatives around every single idea. And then cede control to the participants to switch between these alternatives, express different ideas, and so on and so forth. I thought maybe best to give you a quick video. Looks like I still have time. So we're talking about how might we move away from speech as a modality. So visually impaired people and blind people use screen readers. How might we move away from speech and use non-speech sounds to express some interaction features in the interface? And that's what's happening here. This participant is going to tell us about what he feels about the sound mapping we used for selecting an area of a track. We're going to ask Fiore, who's my colleague, you can see him, to live code the alternative, and then just pay attention to the show, not tell, the demonstration of idea, the control of the expression, and the discussion around it.
Yeah. So last time I had this white noise.
Yeah, so I think you had it right with the white noise in terms of the sound, but where the tweak needed to happen was that if I demonstrate, so if I make a selection here, right, I'll go along a bit, right, I'm going to start selecting. Okay, I've made my selection, go away from it, I want to come back and I want to hear that selection. Okay, I'm there. But now this is so obnoxious that it's distracting me from the music underneath it. The white noise was cool in that it's always nice to make Fiore code under pressure.
So Fiore is going to code in the white noise back. This person wasn't part of the workshop. He just walked in more or less. And notice how he's brought into the discussion as a result of the live coding. Yeah.
So like it is, when you actually make the selection like this, until I let go of shift, that's the behavior I'm looking for when I scrub over. When you stop.
And again, I think the point here is just that is a shift away from how we express ideas to the ideas themselves, right? And there's control at the hands of the participants, and there's just nice engagement that we don't really think about the means we're using. We're thinking about the actual ideas. So I feel that kind of worked a little bit. I just want to give you an example of an outcome of this. So if you're doing audio recording, sometimes you want to monitor the level of the sound. If it gets above a particular level and becomes too loud, we call that clipping. It sounds terrible. You never hear it as a consumer music, but that's because a lot of work goes into making sure that's gotten rid of. If you're using screen reader, it sounds like this. You're monitoring levels, right? It sounds a bit like this. Again, there's this kind of clash, this kind of, you're doing a creative process and there's this blah, blah, blah going on. And participants didn't really like that. And we ended up having a very basic sonification of audio levels that sounded pleasant, that moved away from this kind of monotone speech, and participants really, their ideas, I think, really worked in this case. So I'm going to play an acoustic little track. All the non-acoustic sounds are actually a sonification for monitoring clipping, right? So the music itself is acoustic. The sonification, non-speech sounds is an add-on to this. I don't know about you, but I think this is a much more pleasant experience. It feels that almost when I first heard it, it's like, did you like design like just a novel music track or what's going on here? But it's actually a monitoring feature that works quite well. Anyway, so yeah, so ramps morph into methods and into biases of researchers, and it's interesting to think about functional accessibility and to what extent that actually nurtures inclusion or not. Right? So in our case, that was a clash with inclusive design, and we needed to rethink that. Right, okay, I think I have about 5 minutes. Yeah, maybe I could do it. So I want to talk about another domain, and again, another form of ramps that we came across. This is inclusive education. This is part of the Critical project. This is an EPSRC fellowship that I'm working on at the moment. Critical stands for Cross-Modal Interactive Tools for Inclusive Learning, and this is taking place at the University of Bristol. Now, we were interested in inclusive education. Visually impaired people, or kids in this case, there's about 25,000 visually impaired and blind kids in the UK. About 70% of them go to mainstream schools, not special schools. And there's a whole legislation around this and a whole sort of move towards inclusive schools. It looks like this usually. You have a class of fully sighted kids. There's usually about 1, sometimes 2 visually impaired children, and they have a teaching assistant who sits with them and helps them pretty much in all the lessons that they go through. So that was an interesting space for us because there's a mixed ability, so visual, vision, sight, quite direct, not that kind of separation between client and that we had earlier with the visually impaired musicians. This is people right there together in the space in a synchronous sense. And we looked at a bunch of stuff, and I'm going to tell you about one of them, so storytelling. Extremely important topic to study in primary schools. If you're sighted, you might be given something like this, a poster where you have a sequence of events and you need to trace the events and know about the narrative, the characters, the plot, and all that kind of stuff. If you have a visual impairment or you're blind, your teaching assistant would create an accessible version of that, usually the one that we observed. Take a blank booklet, you pick bits from a story, you might create some crafts so they can feel them. So these are from the Fire of London story. And then the child could come in and then add some Braille annotations and create their story map. Great, except that if we look at the back of this table, we realize that these children are using different text, right? So these guys are using lo-fi paper for their story map. This little fellow is using his Brailler. I found it extremely interesting to compare the body poster of these sighted kids over there working together and these group working together. Not exactly a very nurturing situation for collaboration and engagement. It's a ramp, right? And it's an interesting ramp because it's a combination of the technology, but also the structural assistant that's in place. The teaching assistant, in fact, we call it the teaching assistant bubble. We have a whole paper about this at Kai last year, I think. It's a teaching assistant bubble. It's a class within a class that results from all the structural accessibility features of given the right kind of accessibility technology, the right kind of supports, it doesn't nurture inclusion. In fact, the teaching assistants acknowledge that, and they actively try to burst the assistant bubble. That's the title of our paper. So yeah, so what's behind this? I think there's a question about empathy around mixed ability and mixed age groups here. How do we level the participation in this sort of situations? Become interesting. So let's see. So how much time do I have left? About 2 or 3 minutes?
You have 2 minutes.
Ooh. I have about 20 slides. Anyway, so we worked with the primary schools, 7 kids, 3 girls, 4 boys, 3 with visual impairment, but also adults, their teaching assistant and special educational needs. And again, we had that level, mixed visual ability, mixed age group thing to look at. And here's my cue to introduce Bobo and Coco to you. Bobo and Coco are 2 aliens. Bobo is the one with the bow, clearly, as named by our participants. But we try to use this idea of we want to build empathy between our participants, but we don't want to do it in a direct way about storytelling and whatnot. We want to use like a proxy activity. So what we did was we all were alien antennas. We had Bobo, who landed in the playground somewhere, Coco in the classroom, and we needed to reunite them together. Bobo and Coco can't see very well because obviously they came from outer space. The atmosphere is not very conducive of seeing. And the idea was that we move together in the space, all of us, the children, the teachers, us, and think about accessibility in this sense. But also have the blind children drive us, right, to show us how they might make use of non-visual cues and experiences to make sense of the space. And this is basically centering the visually impaired child as a driver and agent of design in this case. But then we go off and we do some multisensory crafting. We had to pay much more attention to the materials we used. We tried to be as diverse as possible. We used sound, because we discovered that one of our participants' child is fascinated with the recording, so we made sure that there's always some kind of recording features. We use tactile materials as much as possible, but we needed to be careful about how to present the tactile materials, because if you just present them, put them on a table, the visually impaired children lose agency, they become dependent on somebody else. So we had this kind of idea of a box of stuff, compartmentalized stuff to organize the materials, but also the amount of materials, because according to the teaching assistants, apparently there is such thing as too much feathers and too much Play-Doh, right? So that kind of worked quite nice for our visually impaired kids. We had to be careful about have some kind of visual features that were also stimulating for the sighted children, but we also discovered particular abilities and sensitivities of our visually impaired children to, say, the color red or yellow. So these features quite a lot in our design materials. And we also wanted to think about smell. What if we bring smell as a design material? What could that be? So we have these activities where we just put smells in scented essential oils in jars. We pass them around. We talk about the smells. We create a common language that we then feed into our multisensory crafting. I'll skip this, but this is, well, just an iteration of how a multisensory crafted story map turns into slightly middle-fi prototype, thinking about how we might move within the space of stories, how grids are very important for locating space and creating, again, common ground and common language around spatial navigation. And we ended up creating the story mapping tool where kids could create different sounds, manipulate the audio effects of the sounds they create, have these kind of accompanying light and smell and sound displays, but also display those on a grid structure and have a character that could move and retell the story, and they could craft stuff on top of them. I cannot share this. This is one of the stories about dinosaurs. It starts like this. Oh, I don't have audio.
Once there was a dinosaur. A couple of years later, the dinosaur egg hatched.
The dinosaur egg hatched, goes to a forest, meets a monster. There's some lemon smell here for excitement. It panics, so it needs to relax. It goes to the beach, gets hungry, eats a tiger, gets a tummy ache, so eats some stones to help with digestion. A meteoroid comes, lots of sedimentary layers later.
The dinosaur got buried by rocks and sand and became a fossil.
Yep, it did. Right, so again, I think there is a nice way of moving from this kind of separation to thinking about getting everybody together through an inclusive process to hopefully design something that's interesting and more inclusive. And we need to look into whether that claim actually is true once we do some evaluations with that. And again, I'll finish with this. So in this domain, we have ramps as people and ramps as structures. So they kind of creep in some very, very unusual way that can sort of make you not notice what you're doing wrong. So this is our experience. If you're thinking about designing for accessibility, we think it's important that you pay attention to these tensions between doing good by designing accessibility, but also maybe you're not doing so good because you end up creating much more exclusionary technology. And I think I'll stop that. So thank you very much. Some references if you're interested. And I want to thank the children and the parents and the school for working with us. Thank you. So absolutely fine.
I'm guessing that you're going to stick around for a couple of
Absolutely.
minutes afterwards if anyone wants to come and chat with us, Salma. Okay, so yeah. Yeah.
So you mentioned in the beginning, looking at the posture of on the table where there was a vision impaired child and then there were two other sighted children. Through these activities, did you then sort of post-experiment, did you have a look at whether these studies improve collaboration and empathy between sighted and vision impaired children?
Right. So I think this is why I have a big question mark here. So our plan at the moment is to deploy this tool at the school and leave it there for a long time because we feel that the inclusion needs a long time for it to be evaluated. But we did look at the workshop data, so we do a lot of thematic analysis and qualitative analysis of our data. These are actual pictures that are traced. And I picked them up because they do capture this idea that the material, the space, the context kind of brings people together. And the focus is not so much on this interaction between an assistant and somebody who needs assistance, but there is a much more sort of inclusive, interested, engaging interaction around some novel, what we think are inclusive technology. So.
Okay. Thank you very much,
Thank you.
Osama.